First, in terms of pretentiousness, is of course the classics. Whilst everyone else may be reading Madeline Miller or any of the copycats that have popped up in the recent years, if you really want to go pretentious, you have to read the classics. But of course, everyone has read the Iliad, the Odyssey and the Aeneid. Although if you haven't, I would recommend Emily Wilson for the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Shadi Bartsch for the Aeneid. For the truly pretentious, I would recommend a Greek tragedy, and my favourite of these is Medea by Euripides. The great thing about Greek tragedies is that they are dramas, so they are quick to read and very action-packed, whilst at the same time carrying the same kudos as reading one of the epic poems. Medea is a story of a woman who was married to Jason, of Jason and the Argonauts fame. She is also the granddaughter of the sun god Helios. Now Jason has decided to abandon her in order to marry another woman who is both younger than her and better connected politically. And so Medea is reeling from this rejection and from this betrayal that has happened, and she decides to get revenge by murdering his new wife and their sons together. This is a really complex, interesting story that looks at ideas of revenge and betrayal, of power. It is an unlikable woman who is in some cases seen to be unhinged, but she is also a very clever power player. And there are some arguments that she only killed her children because the fact that she killed his new wife meant that the people in the town where she was living would probably have killed those children much more brutally than she ends up doing. It is a really great entryway, I think, into Greek tragedy if you are new to the genre, because it is well known. There are lots of productions that you can see if you want to imagine it staged, and it also has a lot of the hallmarks of Greek tragedy, the idea of hubris and fatal flaws, and also the deus ex machina at the end, for which Greek tragedy is well known. It contains some well-known Greek mythological characters such as Jason. Just such a wonderful play with great monologues on morality and the idea of this revenge and whether she should take it or not. That has a lot of echoes of Hamlet, which equally, if you are being pretentious, Shakespeare is a great place to go. Now, speaking of the classics, thanks to Madeline Miller, who I mentioned earlier, retellings of Greek mythology has definitely gone more mainstream. So if you like things like The Song of Achilles and Circe, and also Natalie Haynes and Pat Barker's attempts, and all of these ones named after women from Greek mythology, but you want to do it more pretentiously, what could be more pretentious than poetry by a classics scholar? This is Nobody by Alice Oswald, who is a very well-known, I think, female poet, and this is her retelling of the Odyssey in poet form. It is a book-length poem, and Nobody is the name that Odysseus gives himself when he is escaping from Polyphemus, the Cyclops. And so this is told in kind of vignettes, little parts and clips of the Odyssey, but it is reduced to a much more sort of physical, sensation-based retelling where the plot becomes less important than the feeling and the emotions and the literal feeling, the sensory experience of Odysseus. And also this is poetry that is really great to read aloud to yourself, to someone else. It has such great rhythm and structure to the sentences. It's very hard for me to sell a poetry collection to you, but I think that this one is really evocative and beautiful, and I think has good pretentious points. Now, talking of retellings, as well as retellings of classics, there are also retellings of classic novels, and one that I love is On Beauty by Zadie Smith. This has double pretentious scholarly points for being a retelling of Howard's End by E.M. Forster, and also being set at a loosely disguised Harvard University. It is about Howard and his Belzy family, who are he is an art history scholar who has a scholarly arch nemesis who is a much more conservative Caribbean man, and they are both teaching at the same university, having a debate about freedom of speech, who can teach at the university, who can speak at the university. And alongside this we follow Howard's children and their relationship as well with the other family's children. And it is, as Zadie Smith's books always are, kind of a slice of life, character-focused look at things like class and race and gender, and in this case specifically the idea of ivory towers and hypocrisy within said ivory towers between people, and the kind of tokenism of the working class, using the working class as a brownie points, kind of a virtue signal, without an actual engagement with the people that you are gaining those brownie points from. I really love Zadie Smith's voice and the style with which she writes. I think this one is very, very engaging. It has one of the most uncomfortable sex scenes I've ever read, but it is intentionally that way. And I think it's just a really wonderful, funny, wry, kind of sarcastic book, but at the same time really warm. It has characters who are incredibly flawed, but at the same time you can warm to most of them. You can enjoy them in all of those flaws. So I definitely think worth reading. And it's a nice chunky book, which I think can also add to the virtue signalling you are doing by reading said books. Another chunky one, and one of my favourites, is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Now, I don't know if this one quite counts, but it is historical fiction set in the Tudor court about a kind of minor character of Tudor history. So it has that element to it of slightly obscure. It's not really obscure. If you're from the UK, the Tudors are one of the main things you study in history. But it has slight obscurity. It is also the Golden Man Booker Prize. It is a Booker Prize winner, so it has prize-winning cachet. And Hilary Mantel is obviously a fabulously well-known writer and one of my favourites. I absolutely adore the style in which she writes. This is about Thomas Cromwell, who was the consigliere to Henry VIII, and this, the first book in the trilogy, is about from his childhood in Putney as a working class boy up until the death of his mentor Thomas Wolsey, who was a cardinal, who is trying to help Henry VIII get a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, but not succeeding very well. And it falls into the machinations of how to move through the court, how to gain power, the kind of Machiavellian nature of that, but also Thomas Cromwell's own personal life, and it really seeps you in that time period. It is incredibly visual, incredibly sort of visceral. You very much feel like you are there, and you are sat on Thomas Cromwell's shoulder. And I think one of the main reasons that I include this is because of the interesting way that it is written in this present tense, close third person, where we are following Thomas Cromwell around. We are sat on his shoulder, the way that he goes into thoughts and those scenes interrupt his thoughts, and the way that he dreams and ghosts and things are present in this novel. It is really, really beautiful, really wonderfully written, and I think a really enjoyable read, but with all that cachet, I think it also fits within this list. Speaking of interestingly written Booker Prize winning books, I would put The Promise by Damon and Galgut on this list as well. Again, the Booker is one of the most pretentious prizes. I think there are probably more pretentious ones out there, but it's definitely the most well known. And The Promise is set in South Africa, and it follows a family in whom the mother dies at the very beginning of the book, and she makes the father promise to give their black servant the house in which she lives. This is a white farming family from Pretoria, but the father finds a way to get out of it, and it follows the course of several different events that are big in this family's life, and also at the same time they mirror important moments in South African history, including the release of Nelson Mandela and is it Zuma, and being caught for corruption within the government. And so it gives you a eye into modern day South African politics and the breaking of the promise, both to this a servant, but also the breaking of the promise of apartheid and the way that South Africa was meant to change and the ways in which it has failed to do so. But as I said, it is interestingly written. The perspectives used throughout this book are interesting because it travels from first to third person, sort of introducing us to characters, following them along, and then sliding into their perspective. And at that moment of slippage, it often reverts to the second person, talking directly to you as the reader, talking to white South Africa and to the rest of the world, looking at the complex relationships of race and colonialism and also class within the South African context. And I think that is really, really brilliantly written and definitely worth a read. The rest of my books are all translated. It is the end of Women in Translation Month when I'm filming this. I think it's probably September by the time you are reading it. But 3 of these are translated by women, but I think translated fiction definitely fits into the pretentious bracket. What is special about the fact that it's from another language, but also it is, I think, interesting to look at different cultures, and the way that you get that from something that has been translated is different than the way that you get that from something that has been written by someone but in English. Some of my favourites. We have a Japanese classic. This is The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. Mishima is a really strange, interesting person, but I would really recommend you read this book. It is strange as well. It follows a group of boys in Japan just after the Second World War, and they are obsessed with the idea that the world is illusory, there is secret in the world, and the adults aren't telling you that there is no purpose, no point, and you can just kind of do whatever you want. You are stuck within these rigid rules for no reason. And they become obsessed with this sailor who is, it's just started raining, sorry if you can hear that. They become obsessed with this sailor who is dating one of the boys' mothers, and they think that he is going to sort of break them free of this world, but things don't go exactly to plan for them. They are disillusioned with him and strange things begin to happen. There's a lot of darkness and violence in this book, and it is definitely a kind of sticky, dark summer book, I think, for me. It is really interesting the way that it looks at masculinity and violence and Japan of the time period as well. I think such a strange little intriguing book. A little bit sexist, but I enjoyed it anyway. Also have translated short stories, easy to dip in and out of, and yet I think there is something about short stories that to me feel pretentious. I think it is the fact that novels are kind of the mainstream prose form, and there is something a little different about reading a collection of short stories. These by Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez are one of my favourite collections of short stories. These are horror stories, mostly set in Buenos Aires, that because Enriquez is an Argentinian writer, and these are translated, by Megan McDowell. Yes, and the Mishima was translated by John Nathan. But these are translated by Megan McDowell, and they are set over, they have there's haunted houses and creepy creatures and other strange events that happen in this book, lots of violence, but a lot of it is about how Buenos Aires is haunted by its history, haunted by the dictatorship that happened in Argentina in the middle of the 20th century. And it is the darkness of the past that has not been able to be let go, combined with the belief in ghosts and things of Argentinian people that bring the haunting nature to this. There's a lot of darkness, a lot of grossness, kind of parts of the occult and witchcraft in here as well, and I really enjoy them. I think that she is a really great short story writer in terms of writing atmosphere and darkness, and I think perfect for autumn as well. Now, what's more pretentious than a Fitzcarraldo edition? The publisher that expects you to recognise the book just by this simple blue cover. Have pretentious book people cachet to read a Fitzcarraldo edition. This is Stillborn by Guadeloupe Nettel, and I really enjoyed it. Books about motherhood, again, are very much of the zeitgeist. Books about strange books about motherhood. This is about a woman and her best friend who decided in their 20s they didn't want to have children, and then in their 30s one of them changes her mind. But the child that she ends up having has a severe disability and is not expected to live long outside of the womb. And it is about our main character's relationship with her friend, about their relationship with motherhood and mothering and care, now that there is a child who is not what was expected, and the ideas of motherhood and how that butts up against reality. It's also about our main character's relationship with her own mother and the idea of what it is to be a daughter, a child. It's really loud rain, isn't it? This explores the contradictions of motherhood and the contradictions of womanhood. It is an ambivalent book that doesn't come down on any sides. It is not moralising, but it is really wonderful, and I think being seen with one of these blue spines, well, that's what we're reading for. Ooh. Now, obscurity and pretension are often linked together when it comes to the arts, reading the most obscure thing you possibly can think of. And what is more obscure than an epic classic from Kazakhstan? For this, I recommend The Dead Wander in the Desert by Rollan Seisenbayev. This is an epic that is framed as someone telling a story to a group of children. It is focused in the oral storytelling tradition of the nomadic Kazakh people, but it tells the story of a man who lives on a rural community on a giant interior salt lake in Kazakhstan that has become more and more salty because of irrigation further up in Uzbekistan for the river that feeds this lake. Why is it raining so hard all of a sudden? And at the same time, the Soviet Union are testing nuclear weapons in the desert near this lake. So the people around the lake are getting sicker and they can no longer fish, they can no longer feed themselves, they're losing their livelihood. And so one man decides to travel to Moscow to try and fight for the people. And it is told in a very strange way, jumps around a lot, there are a lot of different characters, and the way it explores the time period and the culture is really, really wonderful. It reminds me a lot of Russian classics. I think there is a touch of that to it as well, which are also something that I think fits into the pretentious bracket. If you're reading Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, there is definitely a pretentious cachet to those. But I think that Rollan Seisenbayev is perhaps even more pretentious, because who's reading Kazakh literature? Me. And it is a really wonderful book. It is so readable, which is not what I expected from it, but it is really readable, really compelling, and really wonderfully character-driven and also quite strange. And then finally, every pretentious girl's favourite, Clarice Lispector. Here we have Agua Viva, which is the only one of the Clarices that I have read. I read it last year, and I know she is beloved by so many of the lit fic girlies, but she's definitely a pretentious writer. This is translated from the Portuguese by Stefan Tobler, and is set across. It's about trying to write in the instant, trying to write the present, and the concept of the present not really being all that exists and also not really existing because you can't grasp hold of it. And there is kind of a character, there is kind of a narrator and kind of a hymn that she writes about, but it is strange and confusing and meditative and dreamlike and all sorts of strange things. It is a gossamer book. It's just as hard to grasp as the concept which she is writing about. It is one that I think you would consider you could read very quickly because it is so short, but I think it really takes time to properly engage with. You kind of have to let it wash over you, but also stop to think. It is a book where most of the pleasure comes from the experience of reading rather than the written words themselves. And that is a really pretentious thing to say, but it is lovely and strange and uncomfortable and stupid, all at the same time. Those are my pretentious books for autumn. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you have any pretentious recommendations for me, or if you disagree with my definition, please do let me know in the comments down below. If you are new here, my name is Roshi. I put out new videos every Sunday, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.